You want me to say stuff about you or not?
Go ahead.
Roel's sick. He just got back from North Dakota and brought plague with him. So I'm going to go over here. There's nobody in here that doesn't know him, right?
I know everyone real well.
So this is, you know, Dr. Mulder.
That's the only person I don't know. Likewise.
All right, so I'm going to skip the intro. Roel was born. So everybody is obviously familiar with Roel. He was a graduate student here, got his PhD in 2001, had gotten a master's here prior to that. Was hired into the department in the same year, 2001. Has moved through the professorial ranks quite nicely. Moved when I got here, which was 2008. I think Roel was at the Department of Defense in D.C. for a couple of years, and when he came back, he went right into being Associate Director of NRI, which he has now since 2012 been the director of, and he had a little stint in there for three and a half years, probably, whatever, it's too long, as the Director of the Water Resources Institute as well. This is going to be Roel's 6-year review that is now mandated for all full professors, and he's going to talk to us about applied conservation research and where they meet.
All right, well, thank you, Gary. And as Gary said, I'm not going to shake your hand. I was in Grand Forks, North Dakota last week, and was trying to stay away from a group of people that had some sort of bug and caught it. And so I thought I cleared it. And so started the symptoms yesterday and thought, damn. So here I am. So I drove up this morning, and but it is a pleasure to be here. And actually, that was a great introduction in the sense that I'm going to, it's a little short, but I'm also going to pick up where I started as an associate professor, because really I think that's important to start there to kind of give a little bit of context to my experience once I got promotion and tenure and what sort of happened after that, because I sort of took a different path, if you will, and that different path really put me in a different trajectory, kind of a life-changing trajectory, if you will. And following that very brief introduction or review, I'd like to then jump into the task that Gary kind of gave me is my experience the last 6 years in the three-legged stool of research, teaching, service, and extension. So for those that don't know me real well, my background is in wildlife habitat management, population dynamics. More recently, I've taken a keen interest in military land sustainability and land use, land trends. And as I mentioned, to quote Robert Frost's poem, "The road not taken, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. I be one traveler, long I stood, and I looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, and I took a different path at that point." And a lot of that was driven by the guy to the left there. Many of you may remember Dr. Jim Tier. He was a professor in the department. He really was instrumental in establishing the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries in the 70s, and at the time, once I got promotion and tenure, he hung out in the department, and he and I talked, and he asked, well, what now? What are you planning to do now? And you know, my plan obviously was to kind of continue down the normal path, you know. And he said some things that kind of got me to thinking about, is that in fact the path that I wanted to kind of continue? And he, as a person who was in academia for quite some time, kind of took a different path, and he sort of challenged me to look at taking a path where there was opportunities to bleed over, if you will, in conservation and applying practices in conservation and so forth. We all practice in conservation, but his challenge to me was trying to apply and practice and policy some of those things. And the opportunity shortly after I became an associate professor, came up to go to the Pentagon, to go to Washington, D.C. And as Gary mentioned, everyone knows that, but I don't think many of you know exactly what I did in the Pentagon. And so I wanted to spend 10 minutes to kind of give you a quick rundown of what I did, because that sort of sets the stage and what I do now and why I do what I do now. So I did what they call an Intergovernmental Personnel Act, an IPA. Basically, I was loaned to DOD, to the Pentagon. And I worked on encroachment. And what that means is I worked on issues tied to things that impact how Department of Defense operates these military installations. Encroachment are things, external forces like light, like threatened and endangered species, things that could impact a military base, okay? And so those things could be, again, are pretty sizable, because for many of these installations, they're just like outdoor classrooms. So you may have a 150, 400,000 acre classroom, and our men and women in uniform test and train on these spaces. And for them, it's a matter of life or death. And that's not being dramatic, that's really what it is. So their bumper sticker is, we fight as we train, because we train as we fight. And so encroachment is a big deal for DOD. And so my charge working with DOD was basically looking at finding ways of dealing with these issues of encroachment, urban growth, noise and light, frequency, all of these things that in essence impact what happens inside the fence line. And I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean, because again, DOD had a real interesting philosophy. They didn't care what happened outside the fence line. They were Fort Hood, they were Fort Bliss. They could care less about the communities. And as a federal agency, their perspective in dealing with communities was just that until recently. And so you have these spaces that were real large. You know, this is Fort or Camp Bullis, 28,000 acres outside of San Antonio. And if you want to know what the hill country looked like 100 years ago, go to Camp Bullis, go to Fort Hood. Those places haven't changed. They look pretty much like they looked 150, 200 years ago. And when you have the Dominion backing up to Bullis, that light from those subdivisions impacts night vision training. That's a form of encroachment. And so it renders that base useless. They can't train anymore. That space no longer is usable. And so that's an example of some of the things that they're trying to deal with. When you look at the federal agencies across the United States, there's more endangered species on DOD lands than any other federal agency. You know, that's a fact. Because these places, these 435 installations, are these islands of habitat. Looking at it from a wildlife perspective, these islands of habitat. And it's not by happenstance that these installations tend to be in the southeast and in the southwest. There's reasons why these large installations are in these areas. And so again, the approach that DOD took until recently in the last 20 years was ignore it. Just ignore it and it'll go away. But then they soon realized that it's not going to go away. We need to deal with this. And I like this picture. Hurricane Rita, remember this came through College Station, and this picture went viral, and they boarded up the bookstore there on University, and they asked, Mr. Lupo was still alive, I see Kirk nodding his head, and they asked him, he said, why did you board up the inside of the bookstore? And his response was, because I was protecting what was inside the bookstore. That was the mentality of DOD. They were concerned of what was inside the fence line. They didn't care what was outside. But very quickly, like Lupo, they started to realize we need to start thinking about what's outside the fence line, 5 miles and even greater. And so what I basically did I was a special assistant to the Deputy Undersecretary for Installations and Environment. And for 3 years, I worked under regional partnerships. And so I stood up the Southeastern Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability, SURPASS, surpass.org. You can go and look at it. It's still around. But at the time, it was really a real new way of doing business. It was a 6-state partnership of looking at trying to bring together state agencies, the Carter Smiths, the Tom Bogguses, the natural resource agencies of those 6 states, along with all of the federal agencies, bringing them together 2 or 3 times a year to talk about common interests, to share geospatial information. Sounds real simple. They had never done that before. And to talk about what are the things that are on your minds as well. And through that process to start to look at ways of solving problems together. And so that was one of the mechanisms that DoD started to try to solve problems. And it was a real successful and continues to be a real successful way of doing business. So again, their approach to it was a working relationship, good geospatial information, collaborative planning for mutual and multiple benefits. So again, it was a framework for doing things that the Department of Defense had never done before. So it was an unconventional partner. Can you imagine Department of Defense working with natural resource guys for the first time to look outside that fence line, to look outside the windows of that bookstore? And so through that process, they started to identify projects that were of mutual interest. The first thing that came out of those conversations was restoring the longleaf pine. Longleaf pine used to be found over 90 million acres in 9 states, okay? And so this is one of my proudest accomplishments. I was one of the authors of a range-wide conservation plan. There were 5 of us that sat down and we drafted this conservation plan that set the stage for basically restoring 8 million acres of longleaf pine over the next 15 years. And you look at this graph where longleaf pine used to be and what had happened over the years. We wrote a plan and we started to reverse that trend. And again, millions of dollars have been sunk into the conservation of longleaf pine, and this continues to this day. Another project that came out of that was Cockaded Woodpecker Translocation. So this guy down here is a guy named Ralph Costa. He was a RCW, is an endangered woodpecker. It's found throughout the Southeast. He was the RCW recovery biologist, worked for Fish and Wildlife. And for many years, they basically have used translocation as a mechanism for trading. I know this sounds funny, for trading birds between different forests and landowners as a mechanism to accelerate recovery. And so I sat down with Ralph and we talked about, well, what are some things that we could do to accelerate that? And the thing that was lacking was biologists, having full-time biologists as part of that. And so using SURPASS, we were able to basically fund 2 to 3 biologists using that partnership for the last 10 years. Ralph just sent me the final report. They moved over 1,000 birds over that time period, and RCW is going up for review this year, actually last month, and is likely to be either downlisted or delisted, recovered, okay? So it's through this process that came out of that partnership. So that's kind of what I did for that 3-4 years, and set the stage for some of those projects that again have continued for 10 or so years. As Gary said, I came back to San Antonio and became the associate director for the Institute. Why San Antonio? All the environmental commands for all the services are based out of San Antonio. I was telling that to Dave. And so there's a reason why San Antonio is really important. In that same year, I was promoted to professor. became director of the Institute a year later. Neil went to the East Foundation and also became director of TWRI. I was told by leadership that I would be the director of TWRI just for 1 year interim basis, Dave. Just remember that thought. So no, actually, so I did that for 3 years until they replaced or hired John Tracy. And so in 2011, the two institutes merged. Some people may not know that. It's two separate institutes, but we have shared services. So one business office serves both institutes. And so there's services like that that share both of them. So for the last 6 years, now moving forward, told you I'd spend 10, 15 minutes giving you some background. I've been primarily in an administrative role, but I've contributed to the department, college, and agencies in these 3 pillars in research, teaching, and service, and would like now to kind of shift gears and talk about these 3 areas. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to talk about 6 projects and kind of touch on these 6 projects to again kind of stay on time here, and specifically talk about a lot of my work is with endangered species and SSAs. How many folks have heard about species status assessments? Okay, so several of you. Texas land trends. So from a research perspective, some of the work I've done there. Teaching, talk about my work with wildlife habitat course and the graduate certificate in military land sustainability, and some my work with service in both professionally as well as work related to land conservation use or planning. So let me start with endangered species and species status assessment. For those that don't know much about it, 3 years ago, Fish and Wildlife really began a new way of reviewing and assessing the status of species. So it's kind of a new way of evaluating the ESA from a listing perspective, whether Section 10, 7, all listing decisions go through this framework, and this is basically the process. And so I'm going to talk about key deer, because key deer just went through an SSA process, and we were directly involved. In fact, they asked us to do the SSA for the service, which is very unusual. But along the way, we had a hurricane and we had screwworm incident. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So key deer is a miniature race of white-tailed deer. They were listed as endangered in 1967. They're endemic to the lower Florida Keys, and the core population is found on 2 islands, Big Pine and No Name Key. This is a map of the lower Keys, the historic range from Key West down to Duck Key. The 75% of the population is found on those 2 islands, Big Pine and No Name Key. The deer evolved in a really unique environment, in a marine environment. Both fresh and saltwater basically have shaped this population over the last 10,000 or so years. Development is another habitat type that also has played a role in it, in addition to the uplands, which are hammocks, upland hammocks, pinelands, as well as these lowlands. You know, these in essence are uplands. Key deer also have a real interesting history in terms of their recovery and so forth over the last 100 or so years. Historically, in the 30s, their population were estimated to be less than 50 animals or so due to unrestricted hunting and practices that included burning these islands and driving the deer into the water where they were either shot or clubbed to death. And so a guy named J. Ding Darling drew this cartoon, posted it, and he's a well-known cartoonist, posted it in the Washington Post. It drew national attention, and through that attention, the National Key Deer Refuge was established in 1957. He also was a Boone and Crockett member, and so through that effort, the Key Deer Refuge was established. But in addition, law enforcement efforts from a guy named Jack Watson. He was the first refuge manager, but he was also kind of like the John Wayne of the Keys. Law enforcement effort. A guy named Willard Klimstra sent the first PhD student, a guy named Nova Silvi, and Jim Harden. And so those two guys basically sort of set the foundation. Pardon me? He was a hippie. Yeah, man, big time. Look at that. So it's true. So Nova, credit to Nova, sort of set the stage in terms of research. So this year is the 50th anniversary for research on key deer. And so we have collectively a long history in working in the Keys. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about screwworm, I'm going to talk about hurricanes, and I'm going to talk about sea level rise and how all of that fits into this species status assessment. Okay? And so starting with screwworm. Screwworm is a fly larva that infests livestock. The last time that we found screwworm was in Texas. It's a bad thing. It's been controlled through some sterile flies that I'll talk about briefly since the 60s. That technique was actually developed here at Texas A&M, actually outside of the Uvalde Center, believe it or not. And so that's been a real effective way of maintaining screwworm out of North America. However, it was confirmed on Big Pine Key in September of 2016. And so that's a bad thing. The economic implications of this to the United States are huge. And so the USDA declared an agricultural emergency, and right away started to implement several things, both the sterile insect technique, sterile flies, along with dormectin treatments and monitoring of the deer, and we got involved very quickly. The screwworm had a very dramatic impact on the deer. There's about 900 deer at the time, and they found in higher numbers. First detected the screwworm in September. In October, they lost about almost 100 deer. And this worm kind of eats the flesh. It basically just eats their maggots that eat the flesh out of off the animals, and so it's a real gruesome way. But within a month, I would say the sterile flies really impacted or reduced the numbers. And looking at mortality very quickly, primarily males, looking at this graph, looking at age, primarily old males. So if you're taking out the right sex, old males are the right ones, right, Nova? So overall, it's a good thing. That was a joke. All right, looking at the spatially, again, primarily Big Pine and No Name Key. And when you look at the telemetry data, it sort of matches up where these older males sort of hang out. So shifting gears, now let's talk about hurricanes. Hurricanes have long been believed to have an impact on key deer. The highest point on these islands are about 8 feet. They're flat. They're in the middle of the ocean, okay? And so the impact of a hurricane on key deer, either directly on survival, freshwater availability, vegetation, have long been believed would be significant. Some of the work that I did included actually going through Hurricane Georges and Irene, fairly smaller systems compared to what many have often thought of the big one. What would happen if we had a Cat 4, a Cat 5 in a system like this? We have never seen that level of storm until last fall. So Hurricane Irma was a direct hit. And so for the first time, what we feared for many years happened. It was a Cat 4, 130 mile an hour wind, 10 to 14 foot storm surge. Remember, the highest point is 8 feet. About a quarter of the homes were destroyed. And I put this picture. This is a well-built home, 150, 200 mile an hour rated home. And that's what was left of it. So again, the fact that when you look at the survival, we actually had some radio-collared animals. The survival for those animals, low sample size, was fairly high, from road survey indice data, as well as distance estimates, two different types of data. Roughly about 30%, I'm just averaging it for you, were impacted from the storm. So it took a pretty good hit. Looking back at the screwworm, about 15% of the overall population was impacted by screwworm. This hurricane impacted about 30% of the deer population. So again, fairly sizable. Water impacts, about 86% of the water holes for the key deer were impacted. Recovery in terms of fresh water, so the salinity levels it got to the point where they were fresh within a month, but then 2 to 3 months later, this doesn't go beyond October, we're continuing to collect this, it started to go hypersaline, which is what we would kind of expect. We haven't had much rain, and so without rain, those water holes start to either dry up or they start to go hypersaline. So again, fresh water is something of concern. Vegetation impacts. This is a picture of some of the hammock areas. Again, some of the areas haven't recovered. So fairly sizable overall impact. I've got one graduate student that is looking at the vegetative recovery using NDVI imagery. And so this is before, so this measures chlorophyll and leaves. So this is before, after, and then a couple months later. And so you could start seeing the recovery of some areas, but some other areas, and that picture that I just showed you a little bit ago is from this other area. I mean, basically just wiped out or killed the overall vegetation. So again, it's going to be a long-term recovery for some of those areas. And we're going to continue to monitor that using both remote sensing as well as vegetation sampling on the ground. So now I'm going to switch gears again and talk about the SSA and sea level rise. So as I mentioned, about 6 months ago, Fish and Wildlife was interested in looking at assessing the current status of the key deer via this SSA. And so our charge was to look at the overall population needs of the deer, and that ranges from upland habitat, sea level rise, drivers, catastrophes, hurricanes, disease. I've talked about some of those and put those into a model. They've done a lot of modeling for sea level rise scenarios in the Keys, the Army Corps, NOAA, and so forth. And so in looking at some of those models, we basically looked at the least likely scenario, the moderate scenario, and the high scenario, if you will, C2, C3, and C5, and then using LiDAR data, created a digital elevation model. And through that, basically created a spatial model that estimated upland areas. Just to keep it simple, for deer, what's most important is upland areas. All the needs for deer are met via upland areas, hammocks and pinelands and fresh water. And so I'm going to show you those three scenarios for a 70-year period and kind of a time lapse using some of that LiDAR data to give you a sense. And so the green is obviously the upland. So this is 2040, 2070, and 2100. This is the low level scenario. This is the moderate scenario, 2040, 2070, 2100. Kirk's not liking this. He'll like the high one. 2040, 2070, 2100. Not looking good. So the bottom line is sea level rise is going to have a pretty significant impact on the deer long term, especially after the 2050 or so time period. So again, trying to sort of capture this in a deer model, you know, we looked at sea level rise scenarios as I just described. We were able to look at changes in upland habitat as I just described. looking at what the changes in upland habitat, which relate to carrying capacity, would be, factored in stochastic events like screwworm or disease, hurricanes. We looked at varying quality of habitat by tier. And again, in the interest of time, there's a lot of detail in the model, so I'm kind of glazing this over. But ultimately, this comes up with various measures of risk for the service. And through that, again, you can come up with various scenarios that the service could use in making a decision. So that's what the SSA was. And all that information was packaged in a report that was basically sent forward to the Secretary for the Department of Interior to ultimately review and make a decision on. So that's kind of where we're at. And again, the reality is, in the short term, you could argue that the deer are going to be okay. In the long term, if you start hitting 2070 and beyond, it's not a real pleasant situation. So, where applied research and conservation meet, again, one of the things that has been rewarding, I guess, from my perspective, is being able to inform real-world issues or problems. Being able to play an instrumental role in the containment of screwworm, to play a key role in the recovery with the hurricane, with the SSA. Our role in all that was recognized with the Southeastern Award by the Regional Director from Fish and Wildlife. And as I mentioned earlier, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary, particularly with NOVA's involvement here and working on key deer. And we're in the final stages of writing a book on key deer, which is something that we've talked about trying to do for a number of years. So that's a quick summary on the key deer SSA. Just again to give you a quick flavor. I'm going to switch gears now and talk about land trends. How many folks have heard about land trends? A few people, okay. So I'll go through this quickly as well. So Texas Land Trends is a project that we've been involved with for a number of years. It basically draws on two primary data sets, county tax appraiser data and ag census data. Over the last couple of years, I've tried to expand that to include other data sets because I think there's a tremendous value in that. And I want to highlight three of those data sets that we've expanded on. So I'm going to start out by giving those that don't know a little bit about land trends a little bit of background on that. Texas is a large state, 171 million acres. 95% of the state is privately owned. 83% of the state is a farm, a ranch, a family forest. 142 million acres are private working lands. And when you look at the 27 now million Texans that rely on natural resources in the state, about 1% of those Texans own 83% of those lands. So pretty interesting statistics, almost 90% of Texans live in urban areas. 10% live in rural communities. So there's these shifts in urban Texans versus rural Texans. And you look at the shifts in populations moving forward, the more likely scenarios are these top scenarios where we're going to have a doubling of the Texas population from the current 26 million to as high as 50 plus million people in the next 20 to 30 years. Most of that population increase is occurring in and around these urban centers. Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, nearly 2/3 of that population growth, that 500,000 people that we're adding to the state roster each year occurs in these top 10 counties, okay? And so one of the drivers for all this is market value. And so this is some of the research that we've worked on in trying to understand, well, what drives these things that ultimately results in conversion. So we see changes in land loss in the last 15 years, and looking at the land trends data, we've seen a little over 1 million acres of conversion, and it's primarily due to market value. And there's a breaking point. This graph here I oftentimes use in talking to different folks, because there's a breaking point when you look at operation size of about 140 or so acres. So when you fragment a piece of property from 1,000 acres to 500 acres to 150 acres, economically you can't make a living on that anymore. And so then that piece of property flips into a shopping center, into something different. And that's the challenge. If our business is trying to maintain working lands, farms, ranches, family forests, lands that basically provide for the benefits that we here in College Station, in San Antonio, Houston, clean water, whatever those natural resource benefits are, those public benefits from private lands, we need to obviously try to address this real issue. In the last 15 or so years, we've added 25,000 new farms and ranches. We've had that level of fragmentation, a little over 4.5 million acres of acres have been impacted due to fragmentation. So this is some of the work that I've taken a keen interest in from a research perspective. It's kind of an odd area, but it's an area that I currently do a lot of work in, just because I think it's an area that's really important. I had a graduate student that actually studied this. She did her thesis on this. And she looked at not only Texas but other states and found that the process is actually fairly straightforward. You have economic growth, population growth, there's an increased demand for rural land, high land values, an incentive to subdivide or sell, and ultimately a division or a conversion. That's the process in this notion of fragmentation conversion. She looked at this across the Southeast. And you look at Texas and Florida, where you have high population density change and predicted change in number of farms and so forth was higher. More people, more farms and ranches in terms of conversion. Lower or slower economic market value change, lower change or number of farms and ranches. So states like Mississippi that have a sluggish economy don't see that much of a conversion until you start having an uptick in economics. So it kind of makes sense, right? So I hate to say this, when you look at the land trends data, College Station's bullseye. I mean, the Texas Triangle, and Kirk's nodding his head, it's filling in. And the market value in these counties are 300% plus. And it's driven by the fact that there's a high demand. One of the things that I did last year that I was really interested in was trying to understand Texas landowners. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Texas landowners. The average farmer is 57 years old. The average forest landowner is 65 years old. In the next 20 years, our country is going to see the largest intergenerational transfer of rural lands. I'll say that again. We're going to see the largest transfer land tenure in our country in the 200 plus years. And that's pretty significant, because the question is, what's this new landowner going to look like? What's their drivers? What's their objectives? What are they interested in? And we know a few things. New ownership is up. Absentee ownership is growing. And so one of the things that we try to do is better understand what some of these trends are. And from our land trends data, we don't really have a good handle on that. We don't really understand the landowner piece of it. And so we developed a survey instrument that targeted landowners, and the idea was to link it geospatially. And a lot of this was driven by, I had an RPL, a regional program leader from Extension, Marvin Enzer, you may remember Marvin, and he asked me the question, how far do landowners, absentee landowners, farm or ranch? No clue. I wanted to be able to build this graph, this map. Took me 5 years to do, but now we could build this graph. because we asked landowners across the state, where do you live, where do you farm or ranch, and now we've linked it to the land trends data to be able to answer that question. And so I'm going to go through, and I cherry-picked some questions, 35 questions, to just show you some of the general trends. And I purposely looked at millennials versus other, as well as absentee versus resident, just to, again, show you that. So from the questionnaire, we had about 3,100 responses. It was about split between absentee and resident. We didn't have complete coverage for the state, particularly in the Panhandle. And this is what we found. So people in Houston, this is where their farmer ranches were. So kind of scattered, but a lot toward the hill country. In San Antonio, a little closer. And we could do this for every county now if we want. And Dallas, Fort Worth, again, kind of scattered as well. So I'm just going to go through several questions. This is a question that we asked, why do you own land? Why do you own land? And so, not surprising, the top 3 answers were hunting, wildlife, family. Ranching, farming, the consumptive uses, that wasn't why they own land. That's shifting, as you would sort of expect. What species do you manage on your land? Big game, white-tailed deer, big drivers, okay? So the good news for us is very wildlife-oriented. Landowners are very wildlife-oriented. Not surprising, but surprising response. How much annual income do you make from your property? 40%, no income. So I'm not making any money on my property. I own it for different reasons, family, recreation, etc., or less than 25%. Sources of income from property. Again, I slightly different question, and I make a distinction, absentee versus resident. So for ranching, if they live on the property, slightly higher than if they don't, which makes sense. If you're ranching, you kind of need to live on the property. And then this last one here is, in the next 10 years, how likely are you to transfer your family to a loved one? Not likely at all. If you're a millennial, you probably just got the property. Versus if you're older than 40, that's how we define millennial here, you're thinking about it. So you're getting close to that age that you're wanting to pass it along. This is actually the last one. And I'm glad I asked this question because we were about to dive into this. How do you prefer to receive information? A lot of people were about to do this, Extension, TWA, all these groups. And the question was webinars. Todd, how many people are doing webinars? And landowners don't like webinars. And they're expensive to do, and they prefer that information in different ways. All right. The last item I'm going to talk about, and kind of winding down things here, is land trends, but it's related to the military mapping effort. So another area that I'm kind of pushing into with our mapping effort has to do with wind energy and military airspace. So as many of you know, wind energy is a big issue in the state. And TexMap is a project that's a land trends project that we're trying to sort of build on. A little bit of background, Texas, the top 3 industries in Texas are oil and gas, military, and ag. I love showing this to our leadership because that just blows them away. So the DOD is a much bigger economic driver in the state than agriculture, by far. And so when you have 15 installations and all of the military footprints and so forth, it's a big deal. And so when you have a competing interest like oil and gas and so forth, wind energy that can, in essence, shut down that industry, move it to a different place. Laughlin Air Force Base, there's a good chance that Laughlin may disappear. If it disappears, Del Rio is going to disappear. That community goes away. And the reason being, and I'll keep it real simple, is, God, this thing's being recorded. I wish it wasn't. But it's under a secure wall. That's good. Those wind turbines basically is the identical signature to a plane. And if you're a pilot and you're trying to fly and run an exercise and you can't tell, is that a plane or is that a tower? That's the issue with the Department of Defense. And so we're trying to kind of work that through and find out, can we find ways of improving that? And so the Military Preparedness Commission has contracted with us to try to update a report we did for them now about 10 years ago. And some preliminary numbers, just to give you a sense of magnitude. In 2010, there were 7,000 turbines. That's doubled in 7 years. And so, look, these are new turbines. Look at it in South Texas. I mean, there's turbines and transmission lines everywhere. And the impact that's having on natural resources and so forth is pretty sizable. And so this project basically is looking at wind energy and mission footprint. So this is special use airspace. This is military airspace scattered throughout the Texas. And so being able to sort of find those compatible land uses and working with industry to say, don't put your towers here because that's going to cause problems for jets and so forth. And building a web-based mapping portal to share that information. Typically industry is flexible, but you need to get ahead of it. You need to be able to tell them these are issue areas before they go through the permitting process and so forth. After the fact doesn't do us any good. And so that's a project that we're involved with in trying to, again, inform that process. And so our land trends project, and this is again an area that I've taken a keen interest in the last several years, has gotten numerous media mentions. What I mean by that is it serves to inform a lot of partners. Farm Bureau, Texas Wildlife Association, land trusts and so forth, several awards, technical reports, digital media awards, and so forth. And in fact, I'll talk about one toward the end here. So to kind of sum up my research piece, I guess, I've maintained kind of a research and extension program in these areas: military land sustainability, landscape, regional planning, and T&E, private land stewardship. Maintained grantsmanship, publications, I think across the board. I finished the book project, which I'm proud of, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my next section that I've worked on for about 5 years. So took a little bit of time, but was finally able to finish that. And so I'm going to switch to teaching, and Gary, I don't have any slides, so I know I'm running here toward the end, but I'll go through this quickly. So let me talk about teaching. I've taught a lot of different classes over the last couple of years in wildlife habitat management. They're listed there. More recently, in military land management, I currently manage the graduate certificate in military land sustainability. And the table there at the bottom are the courses that I currently teach in some form or fashion. They're primarily all distance-based. I do teach a field course in the summer. That's the field military course. I'm going to first start talking about my wildlife habitat course. This course is divided into 4 parts. As I mentioned, I finally finished writing this book, which I've worked on for actually a long time, probably 10 years, but I spent the last 5 years finishing this book. Believe it or not, there's not a general wildlife habitat textbook, which is shocking. And so I've taught wildlife habitat for about 10 plus years, and I finally had to write a book because there was never a generic textbook. And so this is the book that I use for the class. And the gist of the class, this is a website that I use for class, is basically the students go through the process of writing a wildlife management plan. So it's the wildlife management plan that follows Prop 11. So how many are familiar with Prop 11 for Texas Parks and Wildlife? So in Texas, if you if you have a wildlife management plan, you can basically maintain your ag valuation if you have a wildlife plan in lieu of having cows or whatever. And so that's what the students do in my class is they write a wildlife management plan following TPWD guidelines. This is the website that they follow. I break it up into little bites. They go through that process. I actually wrote a paper in the Wildlife Society Bulletin that kind of lists out that pedagogy, and that's in essence the class. So that's the wildlife habitat course. I've done that for a number of years. Actually going through the process of revamping that course now. The graduate certificate in military land sustainability, in very short notice, during my experience in working with DoD, I found a disconnect between natural resource biologists and trainers in real short sense. There was almost like a literacy issue, okay? And so when I came back from the Pentagon, I basically came up with this notion of developing a graduate certificate where students that are pursuing a career in natural resources were basically informed about the twin imperatives of DoD and natural resource management as natural resource professionals or majors, if that makes sense. And so that was kind of the beginnings of the certificate. And it was to complement existing distance-based degrees that both ESSM and Wildlife and Fisheries have. It's web-based coursework. There are opportunities for field courses. I mentioned the field course in my table there, as well as working with integrating with field research experiences, and I'll touch on that. And the target for this graduate certificate are active or returning vets. That was something I really was passionate about. I wanted a program where active military could pursue a master's degree. And so, the notion of serving those who serve. And so that was something I was interested in doing. Thematically, land management and policy are two areas of emphasis for that. And I'm going to go through some of this, again, in the interest of time. There's 435 installations across the United States. And so because of that, there's opportunities for you to work with those students and working with those natural resource offices and working on a non-thesis project. So I currently have several graduate students. These are 6 students that I have that are active military, and this is where they're at. And they're working on pretty cool projects. So John is stationed in Japan. He's a pilot, and so he's working on taking 10 years of BASH data, bird airstrike hazard data, and looking at what are some of the environmental variables that cause bird airstrikes. He flies a C-130. Well, what better person than somebody that hits the birds? And he's looking at a GIS data set, and it's kind of a long-term data set. So we looked at all of the data nationally, and it whittled it down to the top 10 installations nationally, and now are getting ready to do a geospatial analysis to, again, look at changes in land uses over 20 years and see what are some of the drivers to bird airstrikes for that particular plane. We're trying to kind of control some of the variables. Shannon down there at the bottom is interested in looking at global warming on the polar caps. She's in the Coast Guard, and she's at the Arctic. And so something like that obviously would be of interest to her. Garrett here, I talked about the NDVI GIS. So he's a GIS specialist with the Army, and so that's his project. So he's able to work on that. He actually just finished his stint with the Army, and so he's actually here in College Station now working in the GIS lab at Syntec. And so those are just some examples of how these active or returning vets can get involved. And what's nice about folks, what are you going to tell a guy that flies a a multi-million-dollar helicopter. I mean, they operate at a different level in terms of maturity and so forth. So again, I've maintained a robust graduate student, both DE and traditional. Continue to work with minority students. About 30% of my students currently are active military. I'm proud of that. Working with minority students, about 34% are minority. If you include females, about half of them are both minority and female, and there are the numbers there. A couple of years ago, I received the Outstanding Educator of the Year award for my efforts tied to my work with the military certificate. I was pleasantly surprised by that. That's typically an award that they give to old people. Nova, you got that award, didn't you?
Many years ago.
Yeah, okay, there you have it. All right, so again, down the home stretch here, talking about service, I only have a couple slides here, so well then we just ended. I just had a couple of slides on service, but I may just end there and entertain any questions. Yeah, because it just said product failed. That's all I got. Any questions or comments? And hopefully, while you ask any, I can see if I could bring this back up.
Roel, one of your early examples, you were talking about how the encroachment of cities can actually devalue military lands in terms of what the military wants to use them for. So what leverage does the military have to engage developers to say, hey, you know what, you're really sort of devaluing what we do here. If you keep doing it, we're going to have to move our operations elsewhere. I mean, how do they approach developers?
That's a great question. Several tools, and I kind of glossed over that. So one is through their buffer program. So one of the earliest tools was basically buying conservation easements. So one of the largest approaches to that, or the largest conservation easement programs in the country is actually DOD. It's the REPI program. So that program has about $100 million a year where they outright buy the building rights from landowners. And so they look for willing landowners, it's volunteer, where they basically say you can continue to farm and ranch. They love farmers and ranchers and family forest landowners. Continue to do those type of things, and we'll buy out the development rights. And so that's one real effective way of doing that. The problem with that is there's not enough money in the Treasury to do that. And so they use a combination of conservation easements, they use regional partnerships, so that they use various tools. But the conservation easement is one tool that they oftentimes employ. So one of the things I didn't talk about under my service is I serve on a lot of boards related to land trusts. And a lot of this is driven by my Texas Land Trends work. And so one of the committees that I serve on, our council, is the Texas Farm and Ranch Land Conservation Program. And that program is a state conservation easement program that has about $2 million a year. Originally, we were looking at trying to get $5 million. So we did a report, I did an analysis for the state. We were looking at trying to get $5 million. And the reason that's important is through that $5 million, most of these federal programs need matching dollars. So NRCS's federal program needs matching dollars from the state. The REPI program needs state matching dollars. And so that's the challenge is the states don't have dollars. Texas has never had one until we were able to secure $2 million in the last legislative cycle. So I sit on that council. And so that's one area that I'm continuing trying to push is trying to build the war chest for the state and having that as a tool. Because through that tool, then these land trusts, there's about 40 land trusts in the state, they could basically work with willing landowners to basically conserve this land base in perpetuity. That's a great question. But that's one way that you curb developers. Yes, ma'am.
It's kind of on a similar note as that question. You had a slide of the, I had a question similar. You had a slide that talked about the amount of revenue that smaller landowners made, and that a plot of land is only viable if you have like 140 acres or more. Is there a mechanism in place that doesn't violate privacy laws that gets people talking when a piece of property comes up for sale to kind of keep the continuity of some of those, to reduce fragmentation, to developers, that allows people to know when something's up for sale or
Yeah, that becomes real tricky. One, you stop and think of how many landowners. There's 250,000 landowners, and so just trying to maintain that's frankly the challenge, is how do you facilitate the dialogue and in the transfer of those properties, right?
Yeah.
That question actually, I give these land trends presentations all the time, and that question actually came up, is how can you facilitate those sort of conversations? And one of the things that was brought up is this notion that people that own land, families that own land, are the only people that love land, that new landowners can't possibly love land more than existing families, and that's not necessarily true. Anyone can be good stewards of those lands, but the challenge is trying to find those people and connecting those that are trying to find future stewards, right?
Yeah.
And so there's not a Craigslist or a next door neighbor type of mechanism for that. That's a good idea, though. Could you do that? And so that's what's lacking.
There are groups that sort of do that strategically, but obviously at a very localized scale, like
Right.
nature conservancy.
Right.
They have areas that
Right.
So Roel would get into a smaller scale. Did key gear do better when people are around or when people are not? The reason why I ask that is because so many people interact with key gear.
Honestly, I think development and people have been beneficial to the deer. I mean, when you look at, and Nova, I'll let you give your answer, but I mean, the population is doing better on the islands that have people. They feed them, they give them water. I mean, it's a pretty easy way to live.
It's illegal if they do it.
But the locals, though, are aware of the key gear is endangered.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, so they're more, I don't know if they have a vested interest in it, but they're just more aware of the key gear situation.
Sure. I mean, I mean, as someone that has worked on these wilderness type islands, man, that's a rough place to live. The mosquitoes are rough. I mean, it's just versus a subdivision. You got bougainvillea and hibiscus flowers, Cheetos, and man, yeah, put me there.
So how long has that population of white-tailed deer existed in the Keys?
10,000 years.
10,000 years the Keys have been above water?
Yeah. Yeah. They were trapped about 10,000 or so years ago, and so they've evolved in that environment since.
So in a really, really long kind of evolutionary geological time scale, they're a fleeting species, if you want to call them that anyway.
Right. Have you ever seen that picture of, it has some Native Americans, and it says fighting terrorism since 1492? You've seen that picture? So I think you get a picture like that with key deer, and it's fighting a sea level rise since 10,000 years ago. So they're close to their end, though. That's the only difference. So they've been dealing with sea level rise for a long time.
I guess we'll call it there and let Roel get on his way back to San Antonio.
All right, well, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.